Good afternoon, everyone. Today, what I intend to do is to share with you the skeleton. The skeleton consists of bones and cartilages and ligaments and tendons which would hold muscle to bone, giving the skeleton support. The skeleton consists of an axial skeleton, which if you took the coronal plane like this, and the mid-sagittal plane, that would form an axis, a center line. And this center line would make up the axial skeleton and anything that is attached to it. So the skull, the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, the sacrum, and the coccyx would all be part of the axial skeleton. As would the ribs, which are attached to the vertebral column, all of the vertebra. The ribs, in turn, are attached to costal cartilages, which are attached to the sternum, which you would call your breastbone. Now, there is also another little bone called the hyoid bone. If I turn it like this, you might be able to see it better. That's the hyoid bone, which serves as an anchor for your tongue and is part of the axial skeleton. We're going to start our discussion with the skull. The skull has bones that make up the face, and actually which gives you facial features, and bones which house the brain, called the calvarum or the cranial vault. We have a number of bones that hold the brain. This green is the frontal bone. We have bones on either side called the parietal bones that attach to the frontal bone. We then have a temporal bone, and we have one on each side. In the posterior, we have this orange bone, which is the occipital bone. And if we look on the underside of the skull, we see that the occipital bone goes around like that. And then we see a yellow bone, which is the sphenoid bone. And here is a little piece of sphenoid bone here. And on the other side, here is a little piece of sphenoid bone here. All of these bones come together at sutures. A suture is like interlocking your hands tightly so that you can't move one hand without moving the other hand. That is an immovable joint. So we have a suture here called the frontal or coronal suture, separating the frontal bone from the parietal bones. We have the two parietal bones separated by a suture in the sagittal plane. So that is the sagittal suture. We have the temporal bone separated from the parietal bones on both sides. And that is this suture here, which is the squamosal suture. And then in the posterior, we have the occipital bone separated from the parietal bones by the lambdoidal suture. If I take a look at the temporal bone, this has a number of distinct features. It has an opening. This is where your ear is, and your ear has an opening. That is called the external occipital protuberance. Right behind it, we have the mastoid process. Process is a part of a bone that sticks out. We also have the styloid process. It looks like something you would write with. Something you would write with is a stylus, so that is the styloid bone. And then a part of the temporal bone forms the zygomatic arch, which is your cheekbone. If I open up the cranial vault and I look inside, I can see the temporal bone, I can see the occipital bone, and I can see a very large hole in the occipital bone. Holes in bones are called foramen. And this is a big foramen, so this is the foramen magnum. I see the sphenoid bone, and the sphenoid bone looks like it has wings. It has a large wing, the greater wing, and it has a small wing, the lesser wing, and it has a indentation called the sella turcica. It looks like a saddle, so sella means saddle. And this is where your pituitary gland would be found. Also, to note that there are a couple of openings in the sphenoid bone that are angled like that, such that my pointer crosses over. This is the optic foramen. This is where the optic nerve comes from your eye and enters your brain. Your optic nerve is a cranial nerve number 2. I also see a magenta bone. That is the ethmoid bone. And it has a little bump on it, the crista galli, and it has a porous plate on either side of it, and that is called the cribriform plate. This is where your olfactory nerve, or cranial nerve number 1, goes through the skull. We then have bones that make up your facial features. And most prominent of them are these 2 bones here, the nasal bones. If you feel the bridge of your nose, the little bump on your nose, that's where the nasal bone ends, and the rest of your bone, or the rest of your nose, is not bone, it's made up of cartilage. Now, we had a zygomatic arch, we have a zygomatic bone. That's this bone in blue. Your upper jaw is the maxilla, your lower jaw is the mandible. We also have a bone that has a foramen in it, and this is the lacrimal bone. Lacrimation means to cry. So when I form tears, and I'm tearing all the time, just not very much like when I'm crying, this is the drain, and this is going to drain into the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity has 2 sides, and they are separated by a portion of bone called the volar bone, and this perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. I can also see extensions of the ethmoid bone, and these are nasal concha, or pieces that project into the nasal cavity that increase the surface area to moisten the bone, moisten the air as it travels through the nasal cavity because of the bone, and its extension increasing the surface area. My lower jaw is the mandible, and it has condyles. These condyles articulate with the temporal bone. Here's the condyle, here's the temporal bone. So there is a condition, TMJ, temporomandibular joint dysfunction, where you chew and this area becomes painful. We also see another portion of the lower jaw, the mandible, which is the coronoid process. We also see bumps along the lower jaw, and in fact, bumps along the upper jaw. These bumps are called the pterygoid processes. And then I have another foramen, the mental foramen. My chin is the mental protuberance.